With the GTX 10 series stock evaporating after a long 2.5 years, gamers looking for a mid to high-end graphics card are left without many options. The new RTX 2060 claims to match those GPUs in performance on the new Turing architecture at just $350 US, as well as offer additional features that we'll discuss towards the end. So today we're finally getting around to testing the RTX 2060 against several other GPUs in a few modern games to ultimately decide whether this card is actually worth buying or whether you should hold on to your cash for a little bit longer. So the card that I've got with me today is MSI's RTX 2060 Gaming Z. Definitely a great looking card with some decent thermal performance as well. But the big thing I want to note here before we get into the performance benchmarks is that this card has a factory overclock out of the box. So this does come with a boost clock of 1830 MHz versus the Founders Edition 1680 MHz. TDP is higher also, 190 watts versus 160. So just keep this performance boost in mind when we're looking at the performance numbers and comparing it against the Founders Edition 2060 from other reviews. Under the hood, the RTX 2060 uses a cut down version of the GPU used in the $500 RTX 2070, the TU106. Here we're getting 6 less streaming multiprocessors, leaving us with 384 less CUDA cores, and we're also getting 2GB less GDDR6 memory with a narrower bus width. The 6GB of video memory is actually quite odd in this price point of $350 US, as cards like this, like the GTX 1070, the 1070 Ti, and the Vega 56 all have 8GB, potentially allowing some additional headroom for 1440p gaming at ultra settings. And despite this card technically being a successor to the GTX 1060, it does come in a bit more expensive, not exactly making it mid-range. Despite holding the 60 series title, it is priced to compete with last generation's GTX 1070 and 1070 Ti. Okay, so enough discussion on the specs, let's see how this thing actually performs in games. As usual, we are using our overclocked 8700K test bench to prevent any bottlenecking, as well as the latest Windows 10 update and drivers. Starting things off with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and our frame rate chart in the center shows how the new RTX 2060 fits right between the GTX 1070 Ti and the 1080. Again, we are using a factory overclocked model here for the 2060, but to be fair, we are for the 1070 Ti and the 1080 as well. By the way, if you enjoyed these charts, definitely let me know down below in the comments. I'll make sure to include them in future reviews. Against Radeon's Vega 56, the 2060 is over 11% faster in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, and a little over 9% faster at 1440p. For a $350 GPU, I'm pretty impressed even if half of that Turing silicon is asleep. The RTX 2060 does make a pretty good case for RTX off 1080p and 1440p gaming. Onto Forerunner now, and here we're typically seeing the GeForce 10 series cards have a slight edge over their corresponding RTX competitors, and here the RTX 2060 is just able to edge out the 1070 Ti. AMD hardware doesn't perform too great in this game either. There is a significant gap here between the Vega 56 and the RTX 2060, which does close in the upcoming benchmarks. And again, looking at the 1440p results, the RTX 2060 is definitely capable here, managing just under 90 FPS on average. It's even closing in on the RTX 2070, which is significantly more expensive. Onto a more recent title now, Far Cry 5 running on DX12 at 1080p resolution, and again making a comparison against the GTX 1080. Now, of course, you can barely buy the GTX 1080 in stores or online at this point, seeing as stock is pretty much all dried up, but it's still a worthy comparison to make purely on a performance level. The 1080 was a very well respected card when it launched, and over time dropped to as low as $450 US for some models, which is still $100 more than the RTX 2060, which is honestly coming in very, very close. Also note that the 2060 does produce a slightly noisier frame rate graph when compared to the 1080, which is a bit more stable. Not totally sure why this is. It could be the HD texture packs and the lower memory, or it could just be a difference in the architecture. And here's the full stack in Far Cry 5, showing the 2060 performing at an average of 112.1 FPS at 1080p, around 7.5% faster than Vega 56 and around 7.5% slower than the Founders Edition RTX 2070. At 1440p though, we do see both of those cards receive some pretty decent scaling when compared to the 2060, where it's now only 5.5% faster than the Vega 56 and 10% slower than the 2070. So performance and resolution scaling does look to be a bit worse in comparison to some of the other competing cards, but performance overall is still pretty strong. In project cards too, things did slow down a bit for the RTX 2060 when compared to the 1070 Ti, but still has very respectable performance overall for a $350 GPU. At 1440p, again, we do see a similar trend in Far Cry 5, where performance scaling against resolution increases isn't as good as some of the higher memory capacity and bandwidth competitors like the Vega 56 and RTX 2070. Whether that's actually what's happening here, I can't confirm, but it does seem pretty likely. And lastly, looking at Rainbow Six Siege, comparing the RTX 2060 with the GTX 1080, and here we're looking at 1440p resolution. Overall, in this title, I did see the performance for the RTX cards to be pretty strong when compared to the 10 series. As you can see, the RTX 2060 is actually a bit faster than the 1080 in this title, even with half of the Turing RTX silicon asleep. In other words, aside from what you think of real-time ray tracing and DLSS, the 2060 does have very strong performance in pure rasterization. It's as if the longer that we go down the road of RTX and the product stack and all these releases, the better the value and the offerings are becoming. At this point, it's pretty ludicrous to be purchasing any RTX cards solely for real-time ray tracing in games, seeing as no games really support it, and the one that does, Battlefield 5, doesn't really support it that well. Despite that, the 2060 is a good purchase and does get my recommendation. I would honestly recommend waiting a few more weeks though if you are considering the RTX 2060. It's a great product, but Nvidia are expected to launch what is meant to be called the GTX 1660 or the 1660 Ti. It's expected to be a bit of a cut down model from the RTX 2060, both in CUDA cores and clocks, and of course, without the RTX silicon because it doesn't have that RTX branding. Otherwise, the RTX 2060 is easily one of the better GPUs that you can actually buy right now and is objectively the best RTX card in terms of overall performance for value. Again, the model that I've been using here is the Gaming Z from MSI. Definitely one of the better looking cards out there in my opinion, but I do expect it to have a slight premium for that factory overclock and beefy cooler. Here's a quick look at how this card performs in core clock frequency and GPU temperature, and in summary, the Gaming Z will comfortably boost to around 1930 MHz and maintain a GPU temp of around 66 degrees with an ambient of 23. In terms of overclocking, I was able to push it a little bit further, but not a whole lot. Plus 50 MHz on the core clock and plus 900 MHz on the memory. This gave us a small bump in Far Cry 5, but honestly, the card is plenty fast enough out of the box. I will also mention that Nvidia are also offering your choice of either Battlefield 5 or Anthem with each RTX 2060 purchase at the time of filming. So if you were planning on purchasing either of those games anyway, there's potentially some additional cost savings there too. Anyway guys, let me know your thoughts on the RTX 2060 down below, and let me know what additional content or comparisons you'd like me to do in the future. I think it's a great card and I'd like to do another video or two on it. So if you guys have any ideas, feel free to drop those down below. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching. Consider subscribing down below if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one.